nervous. We actually have a couple mutual friends.
We do?
Yeah, I live in Nashville. Mike Snyder and David Michelson.
Oh, yes. Nice.
So, I've been at this a really long time. And I've actually had a great experience the first retreat I did with you, which was just a year and a half ago at Omega.
Mm-hmm.
Right after, actually it was a few days afterwards when I went home, and I figured it was probably because I finally let go. I was getting a facial, and after the facial, I couldn't feel my body. It was actually a little bit disorientating. I was like, because I had been doing all week at Omega, who am I, where, what am I, the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't feel my body. I was walking, I was like, who's moving my legs?
Mm-hmm.
Whose arm is this? Whose legs are these? And I really got it for the first time. Because usually the who am I doesn't work for me. But you made a distinction at that retreat that you talked a long time about, you find your fingernails, but who is the I that we talk about all day.
Mm-hmm.
So it really helped me to go deep into that.
I see, yeah.
So now I found that when I get really relaxed, meditate a lot, I can almost feel that again, and retreats are always great. But what about in life, feeling that, more?
Yeah.
I have a feeling it's because I'm not able to let go.
Well, in life, this is the way we, our minds kind of package it. How do I experience the same thing in my everyday life? And it's a reasonable way of thinking about it. But that way of thinking about it causes difficulty. Because in life, in your daily life, so much of your daily life is activity, right? Action, activity, and relationship. And a relationship with people, places, events, And if we're trying to sustain a certain experience, then we can't sometimes pay as much attention to what we're doing, right? So there's a different way you can look at it. Instead of looking like, how do I maintain a certain experience or even a certain perspective during everyday life, it's more, the question then becomes, what way of being, what way of doing, what kind of action, and more importantly, the attitude from which the action comes, is an expression of true nature. You see, that does two things for you. Number one, it relieves you of the burden of trying to do two things at the same time, namely action and maintaining a certain experience that you have, right? So, it's hard to have a really in-depth or even not an in-depth conversation with somebody and at the same time having your awareness split and you're trying to do an experience thing, right? You can do it, but you'll only be halfway in the conversation, right? And you'll kind of feel that sort of split. So if you just took that whole way of looking at it and just let that go and thought, no, it's actually more about how does that realization translate into action? How does it translate into relationship? Then you're relieved of the burden of trying to do two things at one time. You're just doing one thing at a time, It's a very different kind of, and it's a question rather than a host of ideas about how realization should look or even could look. Because when we're doing either one of those, we're still in the world of ideas again. And we're not back in experience, connected with being, with that inquiry of how does being move in a way that feels very more clear and harmonious and spontaneous. Do you know? And so with a question like that, there is no image to that. There's just the question. That's really important, because where people get hung up is, as their idea of what it all is supposed to look like. And it will look extraordinarily different from person to person. Very, very different. For one person it will look very saintly. For one person it might look like, what's a good example? Like Yogananda. Very saintly. Saintly, charismatic, sort of in some ways fitting the image of the saint, enlightened saint, right? That was his way of manifestation. Somebody else, the same realization could take a different form and look quite differently. So that's why I say we have to be able to let go of those ideas, come back here, back home, because your reference for what's a more integrated kind of realization and a kind of a realization that's coming out through your way of being is you can sense it inside. That's your intuition, right? It's like you start to feel when you get sensitive enough, when you're sort of on the mark and off the mark.
Yeah.
On the mark and even a little off the mark. These things are very sensitive aids. The body is a very sensitive aid, because it's very subtle sort of discomfort that's telling us a little off the mark. Or sometimes it's even just a kind of knowledge that tells you, oh, this is off the mark. Or this, you feel like bullseye. This is on the mark. And when you look at it, your daily life more like that, see, it gives you something to really be working with, right? And it relieves you of the burden of trying to maintain. Now, when you're doing that, of course, the fringe benefit of it is that it really helps you to maintain a really vast, clear view of things, a more unified view. But you're not trying to maintain the unified view. It kind of comes as a byproduct by, at least in your daily life, by living with that kind of inquiry.
Got it.
Because every time you feel on the mark, it does feel vast and open and more unified. All those qualities of that view are actually right there in a really clear action. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Got it.
You get it?
Thank you so
All right.
much.
Lovely. Thank you. This is a really important issue, because, the world's full of spiritual seekers, or there's a lot of us in the world. And, so often the most common question is, how do I take either my moment of revelation, how do I take my moment of revelation, or how do I take the sort of peace and depth of meditation into my life, right? And so it's such a common question. Like, people ask the same question. All over the world we ask the question, and then it kind of creates a struggle, because you're basically trying to create a state or maintain a view or a perspective. And the intention behind it is perfectly reasonable and perfectly good. It's just that going about it in that way creates a split instead of brings the split together. So you just focus on more of what is it? What's the sense of when you're expressing from that state of true nature? Yeah. And the more you do it, the more accurate your feedback mechanism gets. The more accurate you can kind of sense, oh, that was right on, that was off. And you get more conscious, and then you even get more sensitive and more sensitive. You know, that ability to discriminate, intuitively to discriminate, gets very, very highly honed. And it does away with the dilemma of how do I bring this state into my life. You know, it sort of answers it through the back door, you know, or as often is the case in spirituality, counterintuitively, instead of just, you know, sometimes our basic intuitions are not always right, right? I mean, if, you know, most of the brightest people in the world used to think, well, look out there at the world, it's flat. It can't be round, you see, because you'd fall off the other side of it or something. You know, at some point you just, you know, fall. And, you know, and so if you just use your reason and intuition, and it's just, well, it seems pretty flat to me, and it doesn't even seem reasonable that it could be round. Like, you know, how can someone be on the bottom side of the ball and not fall off, you know? And then you find out later when we get a different view or a different perspective, we realize, oh, it is round. It actually is round. And there is actually, people don't fall off because there isn't actually a right side up and a wrong side up. You know? Right? There is when we're sitting here on the ground, there's the ground and the sky. But when you're, you know, when you look at it from the point of view of space doesn't know up or down, top or bottom, doesn't register any of that. So our it's not so much intuition that's sometimes that can be off. Intuition can be off, but it's more like when we just rely on, what's that old saying? Common sense. Common sense is a good thing to have, but it's also an important thing to question. Sometimes common sense is really right, and sometimes common sense is really not so right. You know, it's common sense that this chair here is really pretty darn solid. All of my sense perceptions would indicate its solidity. You know, if I have any doubt of how solid it is, I just have to knock my fingers against the piece of wood here, and it's solid. But what we really know is this chair here actually isn't solid at all. It's almost entirely empty space. There's actually very little actual matter here, you know. But common sense would tell us this is really, all the sense perceptions say that it's totally solid. But we now know that it's actually not. It's much more nothing than it is something. So you got to kind of watch that common sense now and then.